in the King James Version. You have hedged me behind and before and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Wherefore, where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me.
Thanks, Brother Mike, so much, and it's so wonderful to be with you all this morning. I'm going to send out a group me message. I was going to do that during Bible class this morning, but we actually had a final commitment come through just during Bible class as it relates to Vacation Bible School. And so it's so encouraging to see so many folks willing to step up and to help lead for Vacation Bible School. And we've gotten commitments from everyone to be able to put this together for May the 28th. And so if you're able to, we will meet this afternoon at 12:45, right before our second service, to just go over any questions or any final comments regarding the schedule and the way everything's laid out. So grateful again for everyone's attendance last week and everyone's input going forward. Again, volunteering and stepping up. But then we'll also discuss getting the curriculum and getting what's needed and timelines in terms of preparation so that we can all participate together and help make this a success, not only for this congregation, but also for the community as we reach out and seek to serve in this area. I also want to make mention along those lines of Paul Mays, who will be coming and spending time with us. I think he arrives toward the end of this week, and so he will be here. Remember, Saturday at 5 o'clock at the home of the Tierces. Paul Mays will be there, and there will be entertainment and fellowship, and so make plans to attend if you're able to. Again, that's 5 p.m. Saturday the 26th with the Tierce family, meeting there at their house to visit and be with Paul Mays prior to the gospel meeting kicking off, which will be Sunday the 27th through March the 30th, through Wednesday. Again, our typical service times on Sunday, and then 7 p.m. every night of the week, Monday through Wednesday, he will be here. And also, the preacher will be fed, and so Paul Mays will be fed prior to every lesson. Please reach out to Cindy Welker, see Cindy Welker, and make plans to help him and serve him and welcome him as best as we are able. And then also Tom mentioned that Paul, in his creativity and all the talents that he has as he puts together songs, obviously that's kind of his niche. That's where he really specializes in being able to create songs as we sing and make melody in our hearts to the Lord as it relates to instructing each other in the words of Christ. And those songs are available so that we can get exposure to them. And I think Tom's going to be giving us more info along those lines. And so keep that in mind as well. One final thing before I make mention of some things coming up next week regarding this month. Please remember Sheena Taylor in your prayers. She has the procedure coming up here 22nd, I believe, at Emory. And so just a few hours away, really, at this point. Please keep her in your prayers. Keep Mark in your prayers as well. And obviously we love them and care about them a great deal. And so keep them in mind. And then for the month of April, just a few things to keep in mind as it relates to upcoming activities and things that we have prepared. Remember, April the 3rd, we will be meeting at 2 p.m. So after our second service, we will meet together and collaborate with the youth for digital and outreach ideas. This may not be up your alley. You may not be planning to attend, but certainly all are welcome. But we're very interested in the young people being here. Again, that's 2 p.m., April the 3rd, to give us feedback as it relates to how we can really get to work, apply resources, be more focused when we think about the digital opportunity that's before us, and the young people can provide a great deal of value as it relates to that area. And then finally, last point of announcement or reminder is April the 9th. April the 9th, we have our Widows Yard cleanup. Please keep the widows obviously in mind continually, and the young people are going to help coordinate this, but all are welcome, and the widows have identified areas where they have a need, as it relates to the yard help. And so we have an opportunity to assist them. Again, that's Saturday, April the 9th at 9 a.m. And more details will come out concerning the itinerary, where we meet, exactly when, and those kinds of things here shortly. But just keep all that in mind. We've been studying the topic of assurance this week. Hopefully at this point we're well into the year. You all have a copy of the My Life in Him book. You're going through it day by day or week by week in preparation. We've been studying the topic of assurance. And we've been looking at why we should be assured, how we can be assured. This set of lessons this week, I think, was very personal. The preacher was very personal as it relates to the way in which he put together these lessons. Obviously, that's a style that resonates well in our current generation. And we were provoked to really contemplate assurance, the topic of assurance. And several wonderful comments were made in Bible class this morning. Several folks spoke up and had a lot of really good insights. It was mentioned, of course, the maturity aspect as it relates to assurance, and the difficulty in terms of being able to really capture this mentality, this mindset, this lifestyle, really, if you will, concerning our confidence in God, our trust in God, and the knowledge, but more than knowledge, the embodiment of knowing that heaven can be our home through Him. It's a very difficult concept, and it's one that we're going to continuously be studying and contemplating for the rest of our lives, because we do have free will, as we studied and looked at in our Bible class this morning. We have, at any point in time, the opportunity to depart from God, to leave Him, to disobey Him, to accept and embrace a lifestyle contrary to His ways. And so the question mark will always be outstanding as long as we have a heartbeat. Well, at the same time, we know who wins. We know that God and His people, the faithful, win and triumph over Satan, triumph over evil. We think about the book of Revelation and what it really boils down to. God's people win. And we can know that. And that is a tremendous blessing. And so as we think about assurance, the topic of assurance this morning, and we think about what was just read a few minutes ago in Psalm 139, 5 through 10, God being everywhere, let's contemplate this as it relates to different circumstances that we might find ourselves in our lives. We think about God being everywhere. Sometimes we might think about He is everywhere in the sense of geographically He is everywhere. I can go to Antarctica, God will be there. And in some ways, that's a little bit of what the psalmist is describing. No matter where we find ourselves geographically, no matter where we find ourselves in this life, God is there. And certainly that's a tremendous blessing as we think about location. But God is also there as it relates to our circumstances, as it relates to different contexts that we might find ourselves in this life. And sometimes we are challenged to remember this depending upon what the circumstance is. You take, for example, point number one, when I am suffering. Point number one, when I am suffering, God is there. God is everywhere. God is there when I am suffering. What do we usually think about when we're suffering? We are at least tempted to contemplate the question, where is God? I'm hurting so much. I've strived to be faithful. The child of God will say, I've strived to live according to His word, yet I'm in pain and I'm hurting. What do we say? Where is God? Where is God? And part of that is our understanding of His love. Part of that is our understanding of assurance and our understanding of His provisions and of all the benevolence that He sheds upon us so graciously and abundantly, that when we suffer, we begin to question, how is God involved in this process? How is it possible that He is even still aware of what it is I'm going through? Because surely He wouldn't allow this. Is He there? And what a blessing it is that we have an entire book of the Bible that deals with this question. We have an entire book of the Bible. Some would say that if you look at the patriarchal system concerning the way in which mankind God had commanded mankind to approach Him, to worship Him. And Job is engaging in that system of worship. It's not through the Levitical priesthood here. It's not through the Mosaic law, which Moses would write, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Job is approaching God through the patriarchal system of worship. He is worshiping God, sacrificing to God directly on behalf of his family. And so some would therefore argue that Job is possibly the very first book ever written. The very first inspired account that we have concerning God and his interaction with mankind. Of course, Moses would go all the way back to the beginning, but Moses was writing that, according to this, after Job. And so think about the relevance there. Think about the difficulty of this question of where is God, and the idea of assurance, the idea of trust, and the question marks concerning his presence when we are suffering. And so we see Job chapter 1, beginning there in verse 8, and the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect man and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. Satan, you're going to and fro, you're looking about, trying to create trouble and bring difficulty upon the lives of others, and have you considered my servant Job? He's faithful. He is disgusted, escheweth. He is disgusted with evil, would vomit, if you will, metaphorically speaking, at the very thought of it. He's faithful. Satan answers the Lord in verse 9 and says, doth Job fear God? For not. Verse 10, hast not thou made an hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. Satan says, well, God, you're basically paying Job to be faithful to you. You've bought him off, Lord. It's the argument Satan is making. Look at how blessed he is. Look at how comfortable he is. Look at how his life has been increased from a wealth perspective. But would he continue to be faithful to you if none of that was there? And so God, verse 11, after Satan initially tells God to put forth his hand and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. That's the thought that Satan thinks will come about. God allows Satan, verse 12, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And just like evil conducts itself in every situation, guess what? That wasn't enough for Satan. Satan wanted more. He took away everything Job had, but Satan wanted more. And so God would allow then Satan to destroy Job's physical health. Job suffered. And Job's friends show up, and they have all kinds of reasons as to why this occurs, and has all kinds of theories, and just the foolishness that is uttered then in the remaining chapters leading up to chapter 38, where a discussion takes place. And in many ways, this is what happens in our society. This is what happens in our culture. Even preachers have been guilty of this. Gospel preachers, when they show up to hospital beds and try to explain why this difficulty has come upon the lives of others. And all of their explanations really don't amount to much. And so in Job chapter 38, we then see the Lord answering Job out of the whirlwind and says, verse 2, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee and answer thou me. God shows up to the discussion. God's going to set the story straight as to what's going on. And so verse 4, God asks the question, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. I think this is interesting. We ask the question, where is God when I'm suffering? God then asks the question, where were you when I brought about existence? That's right. You weren't even around. And that alone ought to yield comfort. That alone ought to bring about some level of understanding concerning where we sit compared to God. We say, where is God? God says, wait a second, where were you when I created all things? And what about the things that God created? Absolutely marvelous things. The young ladies' day that I think is being planned for December is being discussed in her home. And the young ladies are talking about different kinds of themes. And I think one of the themes that's coming up possibly is the themes relating to horseback riding, and horses. And it's interesting because in the context here, as God is describing his attributes, his power, comparative to man, in chapter 39, God provides us a description of one of the animals from his creation. We ask, where is God? God says, hast thou given the horse strength? Hast thou clothed his neck with thunder? Canst thou make him afraid as a grasshopper? The glory of his nostrils is terrible. He paweth in the valley and rejoiceth in his strength. He goeth on to meet the armed men. He mocketh at fear and is not affrighted, neither turneth he back from the sword. The quiver rattleth against him, the glittering spear and the shield. He swalloweth the ground with fierceness and rage. Neither believeth he that it is the sound of the trumpet. He saith among the trumpets, ha, ha. And he smelleth the battle afar off, the thunder of the captains, and the shouting. The power, the majesty, the beauty of God's creation. Folks, God is there when we are suffering. Paul would ask God in his suffering if God would remove from him the pain that he was experiencing. And God responded in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and in verse 9, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And I want us to think about this verse comparative to the book of Job and the arguments that God makes there in those final chapters. We wonder where God is. And a lot of times we indeed live in a culture where we expect to receive entitlements and believe we are entitled to everything. And the response that God gave here to Paul in the midst of his suffering is, my grace is sufficient for thee. In other words, resetting the table in the argument a little bit. Hey, Paul, do you realize that the life you have is by my graciousness? Do you realize that the air you breathe is undeserved? Do you realize that your existence, your happiness, all that benefits you comes from me? It's so hard for us not to focus on the hardship, the difficulty, the pain. It's so easy for us to ignore and cease to remember, if you will, all the goodness. But that's why we sing that song, Count Your Many Blessings. And James will tell us, in the context, by the way, of trials and the difficulties of hardships, and in verse 17 of chapter 1, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Hey, folks, if there is still good in this world, if good has existed, guess what? God is there. God is there. And that goodness we are undeserving of. God is there when I'm suffering. But guess what? God is also there, point number 2, when I am succeeding. I have a question. When is it more difficult to forget God is there? We understand and have already detailed forgetting God is there or struggling with where God is when we are suffering. But I wonder if it's actually more challenging to remember God is there when we are succeeding. When everything is going our way, what is the temptation? I did that. That's because of me. I'm so wonderful. I'm so great. Who cares about God? Who cares about His Word? I don't need Him. But guess what? He's still there. And our very ability to succeed, just like in the case of suffering, is by His graciousness. Paul will explain in Philippians chapter 4, beginning there in verse 12, he says, I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. Paul is explaining, hey, no matter where I find myself regarding my circumstances, whether they be positive or negative, guess what? I have learned how to endure it ultimately through the strength of Christ. And so when we succeed, the default, the knee-jerk reaction is to just say, I'm not really going to pay attention to God. I don't have to be concerned about God anymore. I'm finally able to just relax. No, when we abound, we have to learn to remember through the strength of Christ that everything we have, even those successes, is because of Him. And if we're not careful, we'll forget that all that is before us, all the goodness that we think we've accomplished via our own doing, it's really just vanity. Paul will say in the same letter in chapter 2 and verse 3, let nothing be done through strife or vain glory. Don't seek vain glory, empty glory. In other words, it's empty because it does not rest on who? God. But in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Paul will tell the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and in verse 31 that according as it is written, he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. Where is it that we can glory where it will not be vain to glory in? It is only in Almighty, eternal God. The Ecclesiastes writer writes in chapter 12 and verse 13 concerning the conclusion of the matter that we are to fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole, or that word may be added, duty. In other words, it's the holistic purpose of man to fear God and keep His commandments. The Ecclesiastes writer also documented in chapter 1, beginning there in verse 2, he says, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? Now, Solomon was successful, but what does he recognize? All that success, if it's founded on and rooted in self, what is it? It's vain. It's vain. And so what then is the purpose of all this work? What then is the purpose of pursuing success? Ultimately, it is to recognize that it is possible because of the gift of God. Chapter 5 and verse 19, every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor. All of this success, notice, this is the gift of God. And so when I am suffering, God is there. When I am succeeding, God is there. What about when I'm sinning? Have you ever about to experience something harmful or bad or scary? And it's one of those moments where you can see it kind of unfolding. And what do you usually do when that kind of situation comes into your life? Imagine, for example, you're maybe at a haunted house. I don't particularly like haunted houses. I have found great enjoyment as a daddy in trying to spook my children, but guess what? They've now started learning how to try to spook me. And I don't like to get spooked very much. I'm not really a fan of haunted houses. But what do we sometimes do in those situations? We'll sometimes do something with our eyes and with our face when we're in those environments. What do? We like cover and try to hide. And we close our eyes. Let me ask you a question. Does what is happening, does it cease from happening just because we've closed our eyes? Is all the scariness that's before us, because now we've closed our eyes or covered our face, does it just disappear? Does it no longer exist? What's the famous saying in the world? See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Guess what? Well, it's not there. Well, when it comes to sin, if we just try to pretend that God is not there, does that mean then He doesn't see it? What does the young child do with the cookie jar? Young child thinks, Mom and Dad told me not to put my hand in the cookie jar, but what? Mom and Dad aren't here. They won't see. And then what happens? They get caught putting their hand in the cookie jar. And ultimately, Mom and Dad, who are wiser, more mature, more knowledgeable, know what's going on. Maybe they've counted the cookies. Maybe they have set up some things that they know and are going to be able to find out what's been going on. Guess what? God has made it clear our sin will find us out. God is everywhere, including when sin takes place. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 13, the Hebrews writer writes here, "Neither is there any creature that is not manifest in his sight, but all things are naked and opened unto the eyes of him with whom we have to do." Or some translations say, with whom we have to give an account. In other words, everything is bare. There is no hiding. There is no covering up. There is no concealing our lives. God sees it. We also find in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, once again, we were there just a minute ago in verse 13, but if you actually look after verse 13, which is interesting considering the context of verse 13, verse 14 says, "For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing." Notice, whether it be good or whether it be evil. God knows about it. God knows about it. Look back at Job now. Look at Job chapter 34. Job chapter 34, and notice here verse 21 beginning. "For his eyes are upon the ways of man, and he seeth all his goings. There is no darkness, nor shadow of death, where the workers of iniquity may hide themselves." When we were in Memphis, we actually had a brother who was trying to justify adulterous relationships, claim and create a doctrine called the darkness doctrine. And he tried to claim that before someone becomes a Christian, God doesn't know anything that they do. They can do whatever they want. They can marry, divorce, remarry as many times as they want. They can live however they want. God doesn't know anything about their lives. We don't find that in the Scripture. The Bible tells us plainly that God sees the works of iniquity. God sees the sin that takes place in our lives. Psalm chapter 11 and verse 4, the psalmist writes, "The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, his eyelids try the children of men." Folks, we might cover our eyes. We may think we're sneaking and getting away from it, getting away with it, but the reality is God sees it. And when we think about assurance, and we think about the blessing of assurance as it relates to times that we're suffering, we also have to be checked so that we can be assured to realize that God is also there when we're succeeding, and God is also there when we're sinning. And we're still accountable to Him. And in order to be assured, recognition of that accountability and then transformation according to His Word yields assurance. And that's a blessing. Practically speaking, I think we need to press pause for just a minute on this topic. My wife gives me tremendous insights that come in through the news. She'll hear certain radio station headlines and certain bits through media and read certain things, and she'll tell me about them. And this week, she told me something fascinating that was quite eye-opening. According to studies, the first time a male is exposed to pornography in this day and time is third grade. The first time then, the first point in that male's life when pornography becomes a habit to consume is in 7th grade. And by 10th grade, boys then are hooked, locked, living a lifestyle dependent based upon their behavior on pornography. Here's the reality, folks. Let's get down to the nuts and bolts. You can delete and clear your history You can change your usernames and change your email addresses. You can change your phones and your devices. You can even change your iOS and move from Android to Apple. You can do whatever you want to do to try to hide and get away from that type of behavior. But here's the reality. God knows it. He is everywhere. And I know in generations of old, these kinds of conversations and these kinds of behaviors and lifestyles were uncomfortable and usually not even discussed, especially not from the pulpit. But guess what? See no evil. We can try to bury our heads in the sand. We can try to cover our ears. We can try to close our eyes and imagine that those kinds of things don't happen. I don't want to know about that. Wait a second. Guess what? It is still there. And folks, we live in a lifestyle type of environment today that is on the constant pursuit of sensuality and provoking others to embrace it in any way possible. We can delete whatever we want to delete. God still sees it. God is there when I am sinning. But God is also there when I am seeking. Whether it be because of suffering, whether it be because I've sinned and I've realized it, or whether it be because I just want to be right with God and I'm seeking after Him, guess what? We can find Him. We can find and grab hold and embrace God. I want you to look at 2 Chronicles chapter 15 with me. 2 Chronicles chapter 15. I want you to notice here verse 2. 2 Chronicles chapter 15 and verse 2. I want you to notice the bottom section of that verse. Lord is with you while ye be with him. Goes on, and if ye seek him, he will be found of you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. In other words, if you're going to pursue God and not forsake him, he can be found. Paul will tell those philosophers on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17 and in verse 27, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him or feel after him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. You look at what Jeremiah writes in Jeremiah chapter 29. Jeremiah chapter 29 and in verse 13. Jeremiah states there, that you will seek me, God says, and find me when you shall search for me with all your heart, and I will be found of you. Now there's a qualifier here in this verse comparative to the others. And that's the extent in which we are seeking the Lord. If we seek him with all of our heart, with our mind, if we are pursuing and longing after him, we can find him. He is there. Jesus will tell us in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, beginning there in verse 7, ask and it shall be given you, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. God is there when I am seeking him. He can be found. But finally, our closing point this morning, God is there when I am stumbling. So he's there when I'm suffering, he's there when I'm succeeding, he's there when I'm sinning, he's there when I'm seeking. But what happens when I'm a child of God and I stumble? In other words, I've not given up the faith. I'm not lost. I've not gone back into the world, but I'm stumbling. There's this hesitancy where I can feel as though I'm slowly but surely departing, but I haven't departed yet. It's hard, but it's in the middle ground. God is there. Think about what the Hebrews writer writes in Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1. He says, "Therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away." When I feel like I'm stumbling, when I feel like I might be drifting farther away from the Lord, what do I need to do? I need to pick up my Bible. I need to notice the verse here. I need to give more earnest heed. In other words, I need to work harder to pay attention to his word, to cleave to it, to trust in those promises, that he's there while I'm stumbling. And as a matter of fact, this very position of stumbling through life and feeling as though I'm in no man's land, I'm in between, it's actually giving me an opportunity to grow in wisdom and knowledge of his eternal attributes and power, so that I can become more fine-tuned for his service. And James will explain this in chapter 1, beginning there in verse 2. He says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him." We get an opportunity to grow in patience and in our understanding of what really matters in this life, in those moments where we feel like we are stuck in the middle, feeling like we might be drifting away. But if we cleave to God's word and put our assurance, our confidence, our hope, our trust in that, then we can do exactly what Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. "For we walk by faith, not by sight." Romans 10 and verse 17, "Faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God." You say, "Well, I'm struggling with my faith and the assurance I should have in God and in his promises. I'm struggling to be overwhelmed by what it is that I see rather than what it is that I don't see. How can I grow my faith, preacher? How can I grow my faith?" God's word. Giving the more earnest heed to it so that you won't drift away. Are you assured of your salvation this morning? Have you become a child of God yet this morning? If not, you can put on Christ via baptism, as Paul explains in Galatians chapter 3, 26 and 27. And at which point, by doing that, you then become a child of God, being assured of where you will spend eternity. Brother or sister, have you fallen away? Have you maybe started off drifting and for whatever reason drifted farther and farther and have given up the faith, and you need to come home? You need prayers of the congregation. You need to be restored. There's some way that we can help you spiritually. Brother or sister, if you have any need, we're here for you.